Hello, everyone. I'm Leandro Yanaze, professor in education design at the Federal University of São Paulo, and it's a great pleasure to participate in this second International Digital Citizenship Festival in the Digital Accessibility section. It's also a great pleasure to be able to speak with Professor Sean Bracken of the University of Worcester, UK. Professor Sean is a world reference in research on technology and accessibility, universal design for learning, inclusion, and intercultural education, and has a strong connection with Brazilian and international research all over the world. He's also the founder and coordinator of Include, the International Collaboratory for Leadership in Universally Designed Education, which is an international network for discussion and support for universal design for learning. Thank you so much, Professor Sean, for participating in this conversation about digital accessibility. And Professor Sean, the first question, a little more personal, I think. I recognized and admire your efforts to connect with researchers from all over the world. Where does this motivation for connection and inclusion come from?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you. Um, I think it begins from having maybe an untraditional path in education myself. I became an elementary school teacher or primary school teacher in Samoa, actually, in the Pacific Islands. And when I was there, I recognized maybe how little I knew as a teacher in a different cultural context. And that spurred my determination to know more about how people learn in different cultural contexts and how culture and indeed language play a significant part in that learning. So I think that's what's motivated me. I followed up that educational experience in teaching English as an additional language in New York almost 30 years ago. And I worked in New York for 5 years, again as an elementary school teacher. And that's where I trained actually to be a teacher and where I got my accreditation. So I think that I was working with a diversity of learners there who came from a diversity of cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And so that international perspective, again, was a very strong feature of my own learning and my learning from others, indeed, in regards to their cultural contexts and their linguistic contexts. In 2018, I had the very good fortune to have the opportunity through FAPESP and through the British Academy to travel to Brazil and to work with colleagues there to have a focus on inclusive practice. So at this time, I was a lecturer at the University of Worcester, and I had again been provided with the opportunity by the University of Worcester to travel to Brazil and to make links with colleagues there. And I think, again, I could see some strong similarities in relation to how we approached aspects of inclusive practice, but also the fact that we could learn significantly from one another in that international and transnational domain. So I think it's important for us to create those spaces for research, for learning, and for collaboration in that international sphere.
And it's amazing because mainly I think we see the first world countries as the helpers, but in the collaboration logic, we are connecting to help each other, to learn with each other.
That's a really important point. And in fact, I learned a lot from my experiences internationally, and particularly thinking about my last visit to Brazil, which occurred just before the pandemic, and gaining an insight into the experiences of students who were blind, and indeed some students who were deafblind, and recognizing that they could play a really active role within the maintained school systems. That was a revelation to me, and something that we can learn from here in the United Kingdom, and perhaps even more so in the global north, the practices that all teachers had to learn Brazilian Sign Language, for example, and that there was really significant strides towards developing inclusive practices within Brazil, I think. So again, it's a reciprocal learning process. I don't think it's one that is unidirectional at all. There's a lot to be learned, I think, in those transnational engagements.
Thank you so much for this vision more abroad about collaborative practices. Thank you so much, Professor. Getting into the main subject, what is universal design for learning and how it's applied in classroom practice?
Yeah, I think what appeals to me significantly about universal design for learning is that it primarily focuses upon anticipatory design. So it's the first time that I've encountered a framework that really enables educational designers or technology designers to think about what's called user X, so the end user. So thinking about the diversity of our students, thinking about the diversity of technological users, and the vast diversities, whether those may be, as I had identified earlier on, in relation to culture, in relation to language, or indeed in relation to physical or cognitive disabilities. So that anticipation of difference enables designers to think about how best to create systems and processes in education and to design technological responses, which will take into consideration, in terms of universal design for learning, the three overarching dimensions. Firstly, multiple means of engagement. So that attribute of engagement is founded upon what's the affective dimension to the learning? How can we include the enthusiasm of the learner in relation to how we create tools, learning tools, technological learning tools, or how we create courses in order to facilitate the interests and the capabilities of the particular users or learners with whom we're engaged. So the second attribute of universal design for learning is thinking about multiple means of representation. So how can we use the technological devices and options and apps to facilitate that learning? And I know, Leandro, in particular, you're very much interested in gamification, and that the potential for the individual to enter into a game, to represent themselves differently in terms of a character, for example, and to overcome challenges that they may face. And I think that there's real potential for the application of universal design for learning to particular approaches that we might take, such as gamification in technologies. And then ultimately, UDL also speaks to multiple means of action and expression. So that's how do we go about expressing ourselves, creating actions. And in formal education, I suppose that's most closely aligned to the concept of assessments. So how do we create assessments that are going to enable learners to provide evidence that they have attained their learning outcome in multiple ways? So not just assuming that learners are going to, for example, write an essay in the humanities, but that they can engage in activities such as this. You and I talking about the nature of learning at an incredible distance, but we are connected in a really interesting way. So I think technologies provide the potential for learners to really evidence dynamic attributes of what they can do, how they can contribute to knowledge, how can we engage in research, and how can we use the technologies to facilitate that. I think UDL really provides that cohesive conceptual framework which will enable us to conjoin those elements of technology and learning together in a really meaningful way.
Fantastic, Professor. Thank you so much for bringing us these three dimensions of UDL, so important to us as an educator and as a society to get these three dimensions. Thanks so much. But now, in the words of these networks creator and articulator, that which is include. What is include and what its contribution to the dissemination of the UDL at the global level?
Great, thank you for that question, Leandro. Well, include it's the manifestation of a shared idea, I think, in the first instance, a shared vision. And that vision was co-developed, I think, between myself initially and Associate Professor Richard Jackson from Boston College in Massachusetts in the United States. And that came about as a result of conversations that we'd had after the publication of a book called Transforming Higher Education Through Universal Design for Learning, an International Perspective. But it was a focus on that latter part, on the international perspective, that we really thought that there was a lacuna, that there was a gap in that particular area, and that there was a necessity to somehow join networks of colleagues together internationally so that we could foster the ideas around universal design for learning and create the conditions that would be required for collaboration, transnational collaboration, research, learning, and insights from right across the world, because it's a social justice imperative in relation to our capacity to be able to enable learning, particularly from those learners who may have been traditionally marginalized. So include, and it is a wonderful brand I have to share, which is the International Collaboratory for Leadership in Universally Designed Education, was started some 3 years ago, and we're very much informed and guided by our research-informed and action-oriented values. So we have a very strong value base, and I would encourage the listeners to perhaps have a look at our website and to read through those values which underpin our shared practices. We're oriented by a shared steering group, and increasingly we see the importance within that steering group of the learner voice. Because I think initially there was the design of universal design for learning, which took place in the late 1980s and early 1990s in Massachusetts, was oriented perhaps a little bit towards elementary or primary school teaching. But include also saw the benefits and potential for focusing upon higher education. And within higher education, I think when we think about user X, or when we think about the learners, their cognitive capabilities are significantly greater than perhaps, well, they're different. I don't want to say they're greater, but they're very different than perhaps the cognitive interactions and capabilities with which younger children may view learning. So there's a necessity to incorporate learner voice, to engage much more in a dialogue around the nature of learning and about the design of learning, and in association with that, the nature of technological tools and the design of technological tools and the accessibility of technological tools more generally. So that's been a little bit of the history. We've been in existence for 2 years at this stage, and I think we've got a very strong future, because there's a very great hunger, I think, for that element of collaboration, for learning from one another, and to create kind of shared opportunities for learning. I have to share in that latter regard, that my colleague Betsy Dalton, who's also from currently working at the University at Boston College, has done significant work in relation to providing, enabling Include to provide a platform for colleagues from right across the world to share their insights about how they're applying UDL strategies, particularly in higher education, to facilitate accessibility. And that has included a significant focus on attributes of technological accessibility, including obviously from your own university, Leandro.
That's right. But I have to say for myself that it's amazing how much information the website, Include website, has about this international experience about applying UDL. And it's amazing because we can learn a lot and we can take these ideas, adapt in our context, and also share again the application. So it's a very collaboratory, as it said in the name, and it's very rich, enrich our practice. Thank you so much for for this platform, and thank you so much for connecting people all over the world. That's
I think
amazing.
just maybe to follow up on that, Leandro, because it's an important point that you've just made about the website and about how it provides a platform for people to engage with one another and to share those elements of practice. And I think the website is a manifestation of perhaps what follows, what takes place behind the scenes, and that is that capacity for colleagues such as you and I to engage and to share ideas and to swap ideas. And I think one of the significant pieces of evidence in relation to that was the hosting of a learner voice conference at the University of Ibn Zora last March. And that really astounded me in terms of providing, enabling the power of the learner voice to come to the fruition, and to provide, I suppose, a platform as identified in Morocco, for example, where maybe traditionally the learners had not played a significant part in relation to informing the design of their own learning opportunities, but it very much has, I think, since the development of Include, and it does have that potential to transform, to be transformative in regards to international education. So it's a very welcome development, but it's not so much a personal one I have to share as one that takes place within a shared community and across a collaboratory.
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much for to provide this environment, this digital environment, to so we can share our experience and our fights, our troubles also. Professor, the world is experiencing the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and we suddenly had to adapt to homeschooling and this intense use of digital technologies in education. How can UDL be used in with digital technologies?
I think it has incredible potential. I think I have to share in the first instance, though, that we are all at a loss in terms of maybe those more social and personal interactions that we have on a daily basis. So I'm not sure that ultimately technology can really bridge that human gap. However, I suppose the alternative scenario is to be solo in one's room or to be solo in one's house, so that the affordances of technology really do provide enormous capabilities for us to interact at a distance and to share knowledge and to create knowledge, and to facilitate learning that is quite different. I think we're at our very early stages, 12, 18 months onwards, from the significant shift that has taken place to online learning. But I think the more recent developments in regards to COVID have illustrated that we cannot go back to normal. I think the terrain has changed, our landscape has changed significantly. We can no longer ignore the potential power that learning technologies have to facilitate learning at a distance. And when I say at a distance, I mean distance in space and distance in time, so that it can facilitate learning when and where learners wish to access that learning. I think that's what's the most powerful attribute of what we can take away from the significant shift to online learning. However, I think we have to be very mindful of two overarching modes of reflection that we have to take into account in these times. And I have to thank my colleague Aisha Abdul Sattar from UNISA in South Africa, who's helped me articulate and sharpen my understanding around these two areas. And the first is the element of digital literacy. So to what extent do people have the capability to actively engage and inform the nature of their learning, and to be able to fashion that learning according to their own interests and desires, and that notion of digital literacy also being part of digital citizenship. So to what extent can individuals contribute to a wider well-being of community with the use of digital tools and technologies? But there's also the element of, so you have literacy, but there's also the element of poverty, and recognizing that sometimes we make the assumptions that everybody has access to the tools for learning, the technological tools for learning and the technological tools for engagement with wider society. That's not the case. There's a vast imbalance, I think, in relation to access to the resources. And I think that has become absolutely highlighted by the educational experiences from Brazil to the United Kingdom, to South Africa, to the United States. And I think it's very much highlighted the necessity for us to address those two key areas of digital literacy and digital poverty if we want to create a meaningful sense of digital citizenship.
Wow, that's a very challenging thought you bring to us, and it's very important to think about how to be be a citizen if we don't have access, if we have this gap, this technology gap in literacy and in the material access also to the technology. Thanks so much, Professor.
Absolutely, Leandro. And I think this, to some extent, how we can discover the nature of that digital literacy and digital poverty in regards to our own experiences as educators is to conduct either large-scale or small-scale research within our settings, and perhaps even encourage that element transnationally as well. To what extent is digital citizenship being facilitated transnationally? How are people using the technologies and the affordances of technologies transnationally in different contexts? And I think I'm very, very much aware of having visited some colleagues in Sao Paulo, and particularly at the University of São Caetano do Sul, and how they were reflecting on particular cohorts of learners, learners who lived in the favelas, for example, and thinking about accessibility and the technological accessibility and literacy that perhaps pertained to communities within those situations. So I think, and recognizing the material imbalances in relation to technology. So I think these are the things that, when we talk about universal design, that we have to grapple with those notions as we're reflecting on user X, as we're reflecting on the end users. So thank you for prompting that discussion.
And we have also the challenge of the lack of digital literacy of the professor, the teacher. It's a very
Indeed, indeed. And I think that that illustrates the necessity for the types of professional development that Include is providing, actually. And the necessity, I think, for universities to invest in significantly in that domain, because as you've illustrated, you know, COVID has led us to a situation where where there is the absolutely fundamental necessity for educators to have particular levels of literacy themselves in order to engage meaningfully with learners in our day and age, and faced with the challenges with which we have been faced. Yeah, good point.
That's right. We are talking about citizenship through technology, and this event is about digital citizenship. How do you think the digital technologies can help or hinder the inclusion of people with disabilities in active participation and exercising their citizenship?
I think, again, it comes back to design and how we enable design so that universally, so that learners with disabilities can engage as productively and meaningfully and fully as every other citizen. And I think that's a basic human right. I think some weeks ago I was reading an article in the might have been the Times Higher Education, where an educator had shared that in his experiences as a disabled learner, that that some momentum had been lost since the signing of the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities. And I think we need to come back to that, and to have a re-energized sense of urgency in relation to digital citizenship belonging to everybody, and thinking about, perhaps, as I had mentioned earlier, more marginalized learners and members of our communities. And when I say they're marginalized, I mean that to some extent they're pushed to the margins, that it's perhaps the people who have access to the technologies who are perceived as normal, although there is no normal. And I think the more that we recognize that, and the more that we incorporate in terms of our planning and in terms of our design and in terms of our thinking about digital citizenship, that it includes everybody. So that is in the same way that a wheelchair user has the right to access a library, that we could think of people with disabilities, whether they're cognitive disabilities or physical disabilities, that they can access the learning and access their contributions more widely to society through the use of technologies. And I think technologies provide significant, or have the potential to provide significant affordances in that regard, that there's real, very strong potential for, I think, digital technologies to enable access to wider contributions to community and to education.
Professor, thank you so much for your considerations and our challenges you put for us in this conversation. I'm very honored to be part of your network, to be part of your contacts, and to learn so much from your research and from your life trajectory. It's a pleasure to talk to you always, to learn with you, to exchange ideas, to exchange experience. So much. It's always so rich to talk to you. Thank you so much, Professor.
Leandro, I have to thank you for the opportunity, and for the opportunity for me to learn, and for your contributions to Include, and for taking the initiative, I think, to spread the good word of Include and inclusion. And I would invite any of the colleagues who are listening here today to reach out and to join us and to become part of that collaboratory, and the potential to really transform our world and how we think about our world through accessible technologies, so that it becomes a better place for all of us. And I think that's what motivates us all. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
My pleasure.